You know, with all that's happening in the world right now, I found myself trying to understand something that has puzzled people for generations. Why has conflict persisted in certain parts of the world for centuries? Why does it seem like some regions never truly find peace? And the deeper I look into places like the Middle East, the more I began to realize something truly uncomfortable. And that is, what happens between nations is often not that different from what happens inside families. Before there were missiles, there were misunderstandings. Before there were borders, there were brothers. What we call geopolitics may simply be family conflict that has been expanded to the size of nations. The only real difference is the scale of the battlefield. You know, psychologist Gabor Mate once said something that stopped me in my tracks. He said that every sibling in the same household actually grows up with different parents. At first, that sounded really strange to me. Because how can children with the same mother, the same father, living in the same house have different parents? But when you think about it carefully, it makes perfect sense. Let me explain using my own life. I'm the last of 6 children. Between my eldest brother and me, there's a gap of over 20 years. Now, 20 years is a long time in a person's life. The parents my brother met were younger. They were still figuring life out, still trying to build stability, still trying to prove themselves in the world. By the time I came along, those same 2 people had lived through 2 decades of stress, whether it was work-related or otherwise. Over 2 decades of disappointments, pain, struggles, small victories and exhaustion. Time changes people. It changes their patience, their energy, even the way they respond to problems. My mother was not a soft woman and never was. Life didn't allow her to be. She was the eldest child in her family and had responsibility for her siblings from a very early age. Responsibility found her even before her childhood was finished. She never had the chance to learn to read or write, so the world she understood wasn't a world of books. It was a world of survival, of responsibility, and of duty. At a very young age, she ran away from home with a neighbor, my father. He was African, and she was East Indian, in a society deeply divided by racial lines. Both families rejected them. Now ostracized by the persons they thought they could have trusted the most, they were forced to build a life from absolutely nothing. Understand, when people start life under such pressure, discipline becomes part of the household. My eldest brother was my mother's favorite. Everyone knew that. She protected him fiercely, almost like she believed the world itself was waiting outside the door to harm him. But something strange can happen when protection and pressure live in the same house. The child can be shielded from the world and at the same time weighed down by expectations. My brother was protected, yes, but sometimes protection can quietly become confinement, because if someone always stands between you and the consequences of life, you may never fully learn how to carry the weight of life yourself. After my eldest brother came my 4 sisters, and then there was me, the last child. My father wanted another son, but my mother, she didn't want any more children. I remember she told me once I couldn't be more than about 9 or 10 years old, that if it wasn't for my father insisting, I would not have been here. Now, when a child hears something like that, it settles somewhere deep inside. You realize your arrival into the world wasn't automatic. It was a negotiation. And by the time I came along, my parents were no longer the same people who raised my eldest brother. They had fought many battles, experienced more stress, and were very tired. So even though we all grew up in the same house, we were raised in different emotional climates. Children don't just grow up inside houses. They grow up inside the emotional atmosphere of the people raising them. And that atmosphere changes over time. Even the world outside the house changes. My eldest sibling grew up in a time before computers, before video games, and before social media shape identity. I didn't. I knew about Atari. I knew about Pac-Man and Donkey Kong. Same house, different era. Each sibling also brought their own personality into the family. One child may have been quiet and easygoing, another strong-willed and difficult to manage. That may have been me. One may have excelled and been celebrated. Another may struggle and be corrected or condemned more often. Parents respond differently to each personality, not always intentionally, but definitely according to their own capacity at the time. Over time, families unconsciously assign roles to siblings, and such roles extend even beyond the family. And you get titles like, she's the responsible one. Sabrina, she's the quiet one. Earl is the smart one. German, he's the rebel. Even when parents try to be fair, the context is never exactly the same. So, biologically, we belong to the same family, but psychologically, we were raised by different versions of the same two people. Different pressures, different seasons, different emotional climates. Now, if this happens inside one household, imagine what 20 years can do to a society. Same flag, but a different mode. Same laws, but different experiences of those laws. Same country, but a different generation interpreting it. 2 decades is enough time to reshape identity in a family, a community, or even a nation. You see this clearly when families gather at a funeral to read a will and divide property and possessions. Suddenly, old grievances surface. One sibling says, I was the only one taking care of mommy. Another says, you got everything, while I had to fend for myself. Another says, you were always the favorite, the golden child. Now, the argument appears to be about land, possession, or money. But actually it isn't. What's really happening is that decades of unspoken hurt are finally finding a voice. What we call greed, envy, entitlement, manipulation, or lying are often symptoms of deeper emotional wounds. Most of the time, our focus is on these characteristics, which are actually the symptoms of something even deeper. Greed, for instance. Greed is hinged on a fear of scarcity. Energy is the pain of watching someone receive what you believe you were denied. Entitlement grows from someone who once felt powerless and now demands repayment. Manipulation is often the strategy of someone who learned they could not receive attention honestly. Lying becomes a survival reflex when acceptance feels conditional. Nobody wakes up wanting to destroy their family. They are simply protecting something fragile deep within themselves. And when that fragility is never acknowledged, silence turns into narrative. Narrative becomes identity, and identity becomes division. But the next generation, cousins stop speaking and children inherit grudges they never even understood. Now, let's zoom out a bit. Let's look at Trinidad and Tobago, the country of my birth. There are 2 major ancestral streams that shaped the nation. Africans who were descendants of slavery and East Indians who were descendants of indentured labor. 2 communities carrying different historical experiences and different forms of trauma. They did not arrive in a neutral society. They arrived in a colonial system designed around the plantation, a structure built to extract labor, control populations, and maintain order with very few rulers over many people. In order to achieve this, colonial powers relied on one of the oldest governing strategies in history: divide and rule. The plantation was not just a place where sugar was grown. It was a social engineering laboratory. Africans were violently uprooted through slavery. After emancipation in 1834, many left the plantation seeking independence. So, beginning in 1845, indented laborers were brought from India. So now you have two populations existing within the same colony but under different historical experiences and economic pathways. Africans became more concentrated in urban spaces and state institutions, whilst East Indians were largely concentrated in rural agricultural communities. Over generations, this produced parallel societies inside the same island. Both groups struggled, both adapted, both built culture and pride, but both also carried insecurity. You have to recognize that independence did not erase the psychological architecture of the colonial system, because systems always leave behind patterns of perception. And just like the siblings within a family, people began interpreting the world through the lens they inherited. And those lenses, whether true or false, quietly shape behavior. Over time, simplified narratives develop. Stories communities told themselves about each other. Narratives that ignored the deeper colonial design and instead focused on visible differences. So something like race became a convenient explanation. Class became justification, and caste like perceptions quietly formed about where different groups belonged in the social order. But beneath those narratives was something deeper. Conditioning. We need to understand that society shapes behavior long before they judge it. People grow up inside environments that teach them, often silently, how survival works. Where opportunity feels scarce, people learn to compete. Where recognition feels limited, people fight to be seen. Where power appears unevenly distributed, communities organize defensively. Over time, those adaptations become identity. Then the same institutions that presided over those conditions arrive later to condemn the outcomes. The environment shapes the behavior. The behavior confirms the stereotype. The stereotype justifies punishment or control. And the original environment remains largely untouched. That is the loop. A loop that can exist in neighborhoods, in politics, and even between entire communities. When Trinidad and Tobago entered the post-colonial political era, those historical separations did not disappear. They became politically organized. And when politics entered the picture, those tensions became more structured and reinforced. Election seasons began to feel less like policy debates and more like survival contests between us and them. You start hearing statements such as, if they win, we lose. Similar to the family dysfunction I previously identified, like siblings fighting over inheritance. Each convinced the other is favored. Now, zoom in even further. From the nation, to the neighborhood, to the block, to the young men forming gangs. Have you ever wondered why a teenager pledges loyalty to a block? Let me tell you why. Because belonging feels safer than isolation. Recognition feels better than invisibility. So respect becomes currency. Territory becomes family. Reputation becomes armor. And allegiance is often inherited before identity is fully formed. What we are seeing there is not random violence. It is family psychology scaled to the neighborhood. These are the same patterns that operate between siblings, between communities, and between ethnic groups that reproduce themselves at different levels of society. Human beings are simply responding to environments that shape how survival is understood. When we step back, something becomes clearer. Many of the tensions we see today are not simply the result of present-day hostility. They are echoes of historical structures that positioned groups differently within the same system. Structures that shape opportunity. Structures that shape perception. Structures that shape identity. And once those structures form, the behaviors they produce begin reinforcing the very narratives that kept the divisions alive. Now widen the lens again, and let's look at the United States. A nation shaped by its own historical fracture lines. Slavery, segregation, migration, and economic displacement. Different communities carrying different memories of the same country. One community remembers chains, another remembers opportunity. Another remembers arriving later and struggling to belong. Different histories, different traumas, different interpretations of the same nation. Over time, those histories hardened into identity. Politics became tribal, neighborhoods divided, schools divided, elections began to feel like survival contests again. If they win, we lose. These are the statements you start hearing. And suddenly the same psychological pattern appears once more. What we are now seeing is family conflict scaled up to society. But if we widen the lens even further, we see this pattern repeating across entire regions of the world. Lines drawn on maps, lines between communities, lines between identities. During World War I, diplomats from external powers drew borders across the Middle East through what was called the Sykes-Picot Agreement. Oil interests followed, political interventions followed, and generations inherited the consequences. What happened in the Sykes-Picot Agreement revealed something profound about how divisions are sometimes designed long before the people living within them even realize it. This is the same with the Africans and the East Indians in Trinidad and Tobago, and how it personally played out in my family. This is the same between siblings of any family. A nation is simply a scaled-up family with artillery. Caste, class, and race are all methods of organizing insecurity. Caste says, you are beneath. Class says, you are less. Race says, you are other. But psychologically, they are shields protecting the ego from admitting something much more vulnerable, which is, I feel threatened, I feel displaced, I feel unseen. And until that is named, missiles are simply louder arguments. So what do? We don't begin with slogans. Treaties signed on paper don't fix anything because the cause is still not being addressed. The only way to begin to deal with this is with maturity. So the question we must ask ourselves is, are we mature enough to face our shadows? Are we mature enough to confront our perceptions and challenge the narratives we have inherited? And because maturity requires structure, I developed a 7-pillar system which I call the Family Council Protocol. This can be applied to families, communities, and nations that allow us to see beyond the symptoms and get to the core of all our conflicts and disagreements. One of the very first things we must do is state the objective clearly. It's not about victory. It's not about winning or proving anything. It's not about humiliation. It's not about scoring points. The objective is restoration. The objective is the bloodline, the family winning, the nation winning, humanity winning. And this must be absolutely clear in the hearts and minds of all involved. 2, we must create a protected and respected speaking space. A space where persons can share their truth without interruptions, without character attacks. No bringing up unrelated history, where one person speaks their truth respectfully, while others listen fully. 3, we must speak from lived experience. Allow people to freely express what they feel, their experience. Let them share exactly how they felt, whether they felt left out, whether they felt hurt, whether they felt like they were the black sheep, etc. Allow people to describe how they perceive their experiences. When that happened, it meant this to me. No pointing fingers, no labeling. No, you are always this or you are never that. 4, have to take time to reflect before responding. Before defending, repeat what you heard. Ask questions for clarity. Are you saying you felt overlooked? Are you saying you felt left out? You see, clarity reduces imagination and nullifies assumption. 5, separate events from interpretation. You have to understand that the same event carries different meanings to everyone, and all the meanings are real to the one experiencing it. 6, Name the fear underneath the anger. Question yourself and ask, what am I or what are we afraid of losing? Is it respect? Is it security? Is it identity? Is it opportunity? 7. Conclude by identifying the future that you want to see for yourself, your family, your nation, the world. We have to ask, how do we protect the next generation from inheriting this? Because if families can do this, communities can do this. And if communities can do this, nations can do this. And if nations can do this, missiles become unnecessary. What you'll realize is this: the world does not lack intelligence. It lacks mature conversations. No war begins on the battlefield. It begins in perception, in insecurity, in silence. Before the missiles, there was a story. Before the missiles, there was fear. Before the missiles, there was a conversation that never happened. And if we are to shift the trajectory of the future, whether within our families, our community, our nation, or the world, this is a conversation that we must have. This is the sacred curriculum. Lesson complete. Now it's time to remember who you are.